Bomber crews had one of the highest casualty rates in World War II, with 51% lost in combat. Others were wounded, shot down and captured, while 8,000 lost their lives in training accidents before even seeing combat. Only around 20% made it through unscathed, at least physically. Since more than half of bomber crews were gunners, this is their story, the unbelievable things that happened, and the extremely dangerous and terrifying job they had. Let's begin. It was 1943 in England. The British and American air forces had begun working together in an around-the-clock bombing campaign to disrupt Germany's ability to wage war. B-17 Flying Fortresses and Avro Lancasters were the workhorses of this operation, flying from England across the English Channel and deep into German territory to bomb key objectives. The British bombed at night, while the Americans during the day, and at first, this tactic proved extremely effective, obliterating target after target under the lightly defended skies of Western Europe. At the start of the campaign, it was believed that no matter how strong enemy air defenses were, massed formations of bombers with numerous machine guns for protection would always get through. However, this theory was quickly shattered when the Germans recognized the new threat and began deploying experienced Luftwaffe fighter units from the Eastern Front to intercept and destroy Allied bombers. The results were catastrophic. The Allies suffered horrendous losses, sometimes losing dozens of aircraft in a single mission, forcing them to question the entire strategy. Even with up to 13 machine guns in a single B-17 and dozens of bombers flying in tight formation, they couldn't protect themselves against determined Luftwaffe fighters that wreaked havoc on Allied bomber groups. The best defense against fighters was other fighters, but as bombing targets were progressively deeper inside Germany, no existing Allied fighter had the range to escort them all the way. Fighters had far less fuel capacity than bombers, meaning they could only protect the bombers for part of the mission before hitting their fuel limits and turning back, leaving the bombers vulnerable in the most dangerous part of the mission. As bomber casualties kept mounting, an experimental aircraft was developed to try and solve the problem. The YB-40 gunship, a heavily armed B-17 modified into a dedicated Escort gunship. It had an additional top turret, a twin 50 caliber machine gun in each waist window, a chin turret, and extra ammunition. However, once regular B-17s dropped their bomb payloads, they became lighter and faster, and the YB-40s struggled to keep up. They fell behind, breaking formation and becoming easy targets for German fighters, so the idea failed. Eventually, the solution would be the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt with external drop tanks, which finally gave bombers much-needed protection. But before fighter escort became widespread, many bombers and their crews would be lost, with their gunners being the only protection they had, fighting even when their aircraft was burning and going down. To protect themselves from enemy fighters, bombers needed all-around 360-degree protection, so multiple gun positions were covering specific angles. The B-17 carried up to 13 50 caliber machine guns, depending on the version, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire so there were no blind spots. Guns were manned by 5 designated gunners, with other crew members manning their guns when needed. The pilot and co-pilot were the only crew members who didn't have machine guns, while the bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, and radio operator also served as gunners in case of an attack. B-17's defensive firepower was broken down into 6 key positions, with some of them being outright horrifying to operate. The nose gunner had a turret with 2 machine guns, positioned at the very front below the bombardier's window. It could fire forward and to the sides, covering the front arc, and was operated by the bombardier or the navigator. Below it in later models was the chin turret, also with 2 guns, firing forward and downward to improve forward protection. The top turret, also called the dorsal turret, was located directly behind the cockpit, covering attacks from above and operated by a designated gunner. It had 2 machine guns and could rotate 360 degrees, firing upward and to the sides, covering the complete upper arc. Behind it, 1 more gun could be mounted in an auxiliary turret. 2 waist gunners, 1 on each side, had single machine guns and were in the most exposed position, firing through open windows. They covered the sides and could fire slightly forward and backward. The tail gunner and the infamous ball turret gunner deserve more attention, and you'll now see why. The tail gunner was located in the rear of the aircraft, logically, and is often overshadowed by the ball gunner's position when it comes to how horrible their job was. He was completely isolated from the rest of the crew, fairly cramped and difficult to even get into position, having to crawl through the narrow tail section of the bomber. Usually he would detach his parachute and keep it behind him during the mission, and if he needed to bail out, he had a small door that he could release, strap on his chute, and jump out. But try doing that in a burning bomber spiraling out of control. The enemy fighter was most likely to attack from behind, and the tail gunner was their first target. Because he was firing from the aircraft's tail, he didn't need to compensate as much for bullet deflection as waist gunners, for example. This made his fire much more accurate, and enemy fighters knew that very well, so the tail gunner had to constantly stay on the lookout and remain alert for hours during a mission. He had two 50 caliber machine guns, manning them while kneeling forward on a bicycle-style seat. He had some armor in front of his chest and an armored glass panel to the front, but it didn't provide much protection against the 20mm cannons of German fighters. We have to mention one tail gunner, Nicholas Alkermaid, although he didn't serve on a B-17 but on an Avro Lancaster. His bomber was attacked by a German night fighter and a catastrophic fire broke out. His parachute was engulfed in flames along with the rest of the bomber, and the fire spread quickly toward him. Seeing that this was it, he chose to jump out rather than burn to death, despite having no parachute and being at 18,000 feet altitude. However, he hit pine trees and a thick layer of snow, somehow surviving the fall with only a sprained leg. He was captured by the Germans and survived the war. Perhaps the only worse position to be in than the tail was the ball turret. It was the most effective protection for the bomber, electrically operated, moving quickly, and covering a full 360 degrees around and even 90 degrees down. This way, it covered the entire area below the aircraft. The ball turret was definitely the most cramped, claustrophobic, dangerous, and uncomfortable position. In a ball just 4 feet in diameter, there were controls, 2 machine guns, and a gunner curled up in the fetal position. He aimed the gun sights between his knees and used his hands and legs to traverse the turret. The position was the most dangerous of all. He had only plexiglass around him, and most of the threats came from below, either flak or fighters who knew that the ball gunner was one of the biggest threats to them. The gunner needed to align the small hatch on the turret with the bomber's fuselage so he could enter or exit, and he would get into position only after the aircraft took off. Because if anything happened, the turret could be crushed on impact, as it was mounted on the bomber's belly and was the first thing to hit the ground. There was a hydraulic system designed to retract the ball in case of landing with damaged landing gear, but it was not desirable to be in the turret in that situation. He also couldn't wear his parachute due to the lack of space, so it had to be kept in the fuselage. If anything bad happened, he had to align the hatches, hopefully without the turret being jammed, then climb inside, strap on his parachute, and jump out. He also needed help from other crew members just to get in or out, and again, try doing that in the chaos while the bomber is going down. Many of them went down with the aircraft, or were so badly hit by enemy fighters or flak fire that what was left of the gunner literally had to be washed from the turret with a hose. Turrets also had cut-off systems that prevented the guns from firing if they were pointing at part of the bomber, especially the engines and wings. Here we have to mention another gunner, Alan McGee. This B-17 ball turret gunner was on a mission when his bomber was hit by flak fire. His ball turret became inoperative, so he climbed inside the fuselage only to find that his parachute had been completely torn apart by a hit. Then, a second flak explosion blew off an entire section of the right wing, and the bomber went into a deadly spin toward the ground. Alan lost consciousness and was thrown from the aircraft at an altitude of 22,000 feet, without a parachute. He fell through the glass roof of a train station in France and somehow survived the fall, although with severe injuries. However, he would recover and survive the war. Even if we take away the enormous risk of enemy flak and interceptor fighters, simply serving on bombers in World War II was an extremely dangerous and uncomfortable experience for all crew members. Flying at high altitudes in unpressurized cabins, temperatures would drop to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, so airmen had to wear electrically heated suits and oxygen masks just to stay alive. If their equipment failed, they could suffer severe frostbite, and if their oxygen supply was cut, they would fall asleep without even realizing it. If no one noticed within a couple of minutes, they would never wake up. The cold was so extreme that gunners could lose their fingers just by touching the frozen metal of their machine guns without gloves, and if they were hit by shrapnel, their blood would freeze as it left their body. Parachutes weren't very reliable, and crews had to bail out through narrow escape hatches while wearing bulky flight gear, all while their aircraft was spiraling out of control or burning. Only 25% of airmen managed to bail out and successfully deploy their parachutes, while some bombers like the Avro Lancaster had an even lower survival rate of just 15% due to smaller and poorly positioned escape hatches. Around 10,000 crew members who survived being shot down became prisoners of war, enduring horrific conditions in prisoner camps for months or even years before being liberated, and many of them never lived to see the end of the war.